Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. And today I'm going to talk just a little bit about a few thoughts that I've had, reflecting on the fact that it's been 5 years since my deconversion from Christianity. And there's a lot of things in my mind. I could probably talk for hours about the journey and where it's taken me and so forth, but I just wanted to talk about a few things. I'm going to start by just giving a quick summary of what I've been through, what my journey was like getting out of Christianity. And then I'm going to wrap up with a few thoughts on some sort of big ideas that have been the heavy hitters in the last 5 years. Like, what are the things that have come to mean the most to me in terms of what I'm experiencing and thinking through. But just taking it back to my story, it's so hard to believe that it's been 5 years since I took that final step out of Christianity. In some ways, it's hard to believe because it feels like it was a lot longer. In other ways, it feels like it wasn't that long ago. But it has been 5 years of reclaiming my life and my thoughts and my freedom. And I wanted to share with you some of the reflections I've had since walking away from Christianity. I'll get into that in a few minutes. But whether you've been on this journey for years or you're just starting to question what you've believed your whole life, I hope some of the things that I say resonate with you. I'm going to dive into some heavy stuff and also some light stuff. But I think we're going to basically keep circling around the idea that Christianity is more than just flawed and erroneous. It's very toxic and abusive. And I'm going to share some of how I've healed and what that freedom looks like. And also throw in a little humor here or there because, honestly, you have to laugh or you'll cry. And I think you really have to laugh at just how absurd it all was. But for most of my life, Christianity wasn't just something I believed in. It was my identity. It was everything. I trusted Jesus at the age of 5 and devoted myself entirely to my love relationship with the Lord. I memorized thousands of Bible verses. I attended Bible college and mission school. I poured my heart into studying and teaching and sharing the gospel. My faith wasn't just part of my life. It was my life. Jesus meant the world to me. He was my everything. The fact that he had come and died for my sins and didn't have to. He chose to out of his loving heart. He chose to make a way for me to have peace with the Father, to deal with the sin problem, and that by his death and resurrection, I was able to be born again, to have his righteousness cover me, and to be, at that point, able to be restored and to have a way to go to heaven. That was my everything. I lived my life out of gratitude for what Christ had done for me. And I lived my life out of a desire to share that gospel, that good news that people also could be saved if they would turn from their sins to Jesus and let his death and resurrection cover their sin. Of course, I taught my own kids about the Bible every night when they were younger, following the same path that had been laid out for me and that most Christians would do. But things did shift. And I like to say, as much as Jesus used to be my Savior, my kids in many ways were actually my Savior. We were singing Bible stories, Bible songs about the conquest of Canaan. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, which in the larger context is actually about genocide and land theft and slavery and child brides and stoning. And for the first time in my life, I began to see those stories in a new light. And it was like a splinter in my mind and a prick in my heart to say, can you really teach these kids that stuff? Can you teach them to defend genocide? Is that okay with you? Those stories weren't just uncomfortable or difficult to explain. They became horrific to me. It was like a complete breakdown of everything I had believed eventually. I couldn't understand how the God I loved could command these atrocities. And looking back, that's where some of the most major cracks in my faith began to form. There were some other smaller cracks before, to be sure, and certainly it grew from there. But that was the first time looking back that I could say, something is shifting. Something's really different here. And I have some issues to figure out. And at first it was mostly about the morality of the Bible that troubled me. But as I dug a lot deeper over time, I found so much more, so many more issues to wrestle with. I started noticing the discrepancies and the contradictions that despite the Christian apologists waving of their magic wand, these things could not be explained away. And the deeper that I went, the more I uncovered. And I found the Bible stories were not unique, and they did not look at all like they were divinely inspired. They looked very man-made. They looked man-made by tribal men. and very violent tribal at that. I learned that many of them were borrowed from older religions and older mythologies. I learned that the Yahweh that I'd come to know as the God of the Bible had once been a very different character. He'd been part of a pantheon, even had a wife named Asherah, and even that story had evolved from there and before there. So the story of Jesus was sort of my linchpin. Like, is Jesus God or not? I discovered that the story of Jesus wasn't unique either. There were tales of dying and rising gods long before Christianity. And what I once thought was the greatest truth of my life turned out to be mythology repackaged. And despite the best efforts of the apologists to over and over try to say, there's nothing here, don't look behind the curtain, there are no other dying and rising gods like Jesus, I found that it just wasn't true. It took me many years. It was about a 3 or 4 year process from the time that I began to really ask these questions in earnest until I finally deconverted. But realizing these things, that the Yahweh character had been part of an evolved story and an evolved character, that Jesus was the same. It was like having the ground pulled out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about God, the Bible, and my faith slowly came crashing down. I didn't realize it at first. I didn't know what was happening, and I would have said, probably close to almost the very end, that I'm still a Christian and that I believe in Jesus. But eventually my faith did come crashing down, and there was no going back. Once I saw the Bible for what it was, I couldn't unsee it. Christianity wasn't divine truth. It was an amalgamation of ancient stories stitched together to form a narrative, and this mythological narrative had shaped my entire life. And in these moments of clarity and enlightenment and understanding and just basic information sometimes, it felt like a dam breaking. All the doubts and the questions that I had kept hidden flooded to the surface. And on a Saturday at the end of September 2019, within that hour, my entire belief system collapsed, and I found myself fully deconverted. Some of the first questions that came to my mind when I was in that hour were questions like, is it possible that millions of Christians over thousands of years could have all been duped, all been suckers, all been believing this thing that wasn't real? And my knee-jerk reaction was to say, of course not, that's too many people. There's no way that we were all en masse deceived. But as soon as I had that thought, I immediately corrected myself and said, well, we think the Muslims are all wrong, the Buddhists are all wrong, the Hindus are all wrong, all these other religions are all wrong. Why couldn't we have been all wrong? Lots of us. For a long time. And I slowly began to say to myself, this doesn't make sense. This worldview has never made sense. A God who demands blood to forgive, and that comes, of course, from ancient Judaism, but then that comes from ancient Egypt, where they had blood sacrifices and blood magic. They had circumcision in ancient Egypt. They had pork taboos. They had a Sabbath. And you go back earlier, and some of these things go back to ancient Mesopotamia and other groups, and you think, I can see how this whole thing is just a mythological, philosophical worldview evolution that keeps on taking different forms based on which culture it gets exposed to and which syncretism is next in line. And I admitted to myself, I was like talking it out and saying, say it, Tim, say it. Say the words. It's not real. And I finally said it, it's not real. And it was like, yes, the whole house of cards came falling down, but it was also like the greatest freedom to say, wow, that's why this has never made sense. That's why there's so many issues with this worldview. That's why this God who claims to not be the author of confusion has confusion all over the place. That's why the issues of unanswered prayer and children dying of cancer and dying of starvation and children being assaulted and God never does anything, endless issues. That's why these things look this way, because there's no God coming to their rescue, because he's not there. Why did I feel alone for so many years when I pray and think, God, are you even there? Are you answering my questions? Do you even care? The reason it felt like he wasn't there and didn't care and wasn't answering me was because he wasn't there. And I finally admitted it. And sort of like the opposite of C.S. Lewis, I went kicking and screaming out of Christianity. But as much as I went kicking and screaming out of it, I was also delighted to know the truth. I'd rather know the truth than live an unexamined life and live a lie. With the collapse of my belief in Jesus and the Bible and God came a profound sense of freedom. I was no longer bound to a system of belief that was built on lies and fear and manipulation. I had truly broken free. And that's why I call this the Bible prison. And I couldn't have been happier. I was free of a whole worldview and a whole system of lies. 5 years. That's how long it's been since I pried open these prison gates of Christianity and stumbled into the overwhelming light of freedom. Half a decade. Feels like it goes by in the blink of an eye. And in other ways, it feels like an eternity. Sort of fleeting but infinite, like a single heartbeat that echoes into a lifetime. It's hard to picture all the things that have happened since then. These 5 years have unfolded sort of like a vast horizon, like an endless landscape where I never knew certain things that had existed. Possibilities I hadn't dared to dream of ever while I was trapped in this narrow, suffocating cage of Christianity. And when I look back at the person I used to be, that person feels like a distant stranger. Those years inside the faith are like a foggy memory now of a life I no longer claim, and honestly it feels like I can't even believe I was there. The further I get from it, the more surreal it becomes that I was ever a Christian. Why did I believe this stuff? Why did I love my captor? Why did I call a psychopath a good father? It's like a bad dream that fades as you're waking up, but it's still kind of clinging to the edges of your mind. But here I am today, with this overwhelming mix of emotions. Gratitude, of course, deep and fierce for the freedom I now have. I can breathe into every corner of my life. From the release from fear, from guilt. But alongside that immense joy, there's also grief, this undercurrent of sadness for the years lost, for the errors, for the grave mistakes in terms of thinking that I was doing good when I was in ministry. Years spent serving an ideology that manipulated me and others, that fed on my deepest insecurities, poisoned my mind with lies, and I passed them on for many years. I was held hostage by a belief system that promised love, but ultimately delivered only shame, that wrapped me in chains and called it protection. I believed those chains were saving me and keeping me safe from some dangerous world beyond. But in truth, they were the very thing that were suffocating me. They were draining the life from me. Leaving Christianity was not necessarily a graceful exit, and it wasn't ultimately a slow drift towards something better. At the time, it was a wild ripping away, almost a tearing apart of everything I thought I was. For years, I'd been conditioned to see myself as broken, sinful, and in constant need of redemption. Every desire, every thought was suspect, scrutinized under the harsh glare of religious doctrine. Think of it like living in a house where every window is nailed shut and every door is locked from the outside. And you convince yourself that the darkness and the stale air is just fine. The dim light is enough, and the shadows are okay. And they're actually good. And then one day, a crack somehow appears and lets in some sunlight, and you realize that this environment has been choking you. The darkness has been suffocating you for years. That's sort of what it felt like. This shocking realization that the cage I'd lived in, Christianity, was slowly killing me. And once you see that light and breathe that fresh air, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing the lie. The chains fall away, and the scales fall from your eyes, as it were. The truth comes in and sets you free, and it's like you're left trembling at what has just happened. You're sort of almost terrified of what is beyond the prison bars that you've been in. But once that light starts pouring in, you realize the cage was never protecting you. The cage was the prison. When you've been immersed in Christianity for as long as I was, over 40 years, when you've been immersed in Christianity for as long as I was, it's almost like you don't realize how trapped you are. You convince yourself that this prison is your safety, sheltering you, but it's really cutting you off from life. And I spent years in that prison, in that box, convincing myself that if I just prayed hard enough, if I surrendered enough, I'd find peace and joy. But the true peace never came. The peace that passes all understanding. Looking back over 40 years, it was never there. I had more peace in the first hour and the first day after deconverting from Christianity than I had in over 40 years combined. It felt like the whole time I'd been trying to breathe through a straw, and it just could never quite fill my lungs up. The promise of salvation was like this cruel mirage, this water in the desert that's always out of reach. Looking back, I feel in some ways like I was just constantly chasing a salvation and a sanctification that I was never going to achieve. And I never stopped to question why I was running and working so much. The love of God was always dangled in front of me like a carrot, always pulling me forward, never allowing me to reach it. The first cracks of my faith, like I said, were these issues of the genocide of the conquest of Canaan through Joshua and the Israelites. But those cracks were so subtle at first that I didn't notice. They're sort of like hairline fractures in a piece of glass or a mirror. They're barely visible at first, but eventually they're impossible to see once you see them. And the questions grew. Things like, why would a loving God allow so much suffering in this world? Why would God allow children to die of starvation by the thousands every day? And going strictly to the Bible, why does the Bible contradict itself so badly, so many times? And why are Christians so unwilling to see this? Why can't they see those contradictions? Why do they have this narrative that they have to protect at all costs? And they're unwilling to say, this has errors in it, and it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. I did try to brush those doubts aside for a season, because I'd been taught that questioning God was a form of rebellion. But the answers that were once sort of soothing and enough for that day, eventually they felt hollow. Sort of like a little Band-Aid on a huge cut. It's just not enough. It's a huge wound, and it was growing, and it needed to be addressed. The cracks in the wall grew wider. The dam holding back the flood just slowly weakened. My questions kept on coming, getting bigger and bigger, as if it was a tsunami. This erosion of faith and this flood of questions brought me to a place where there was just no going back. Each question, each understanding of where the Bible had come from, where the mythology had been copied from, each understanding of how canonicity had worked, and how books of the Bible had come in and gone out of the canon several times, how church councils of men of very questionable character had made these decisions for us hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It just didn't make sense anymore. Each question ripped away another piece of this carefully constructed narrative that I had built my life around. Why would God create hell was another one. Why is it okay to torture people forever? Why can't they have a second chance in hell? And a third chance, and a fourth chance? Why does hell have to be so permanent? And why are Christians more obsessed with judgment than love? The answers that I've been given by Christians, they couldn't satisfy me at all. And eventually they looked really foolish. They felt like distractions designed to keep me from looking too closely. And my faith began to look more and more like a house of cards, held together very fragilely by fear and guilt. And the weight of my doubts kept pressing down, and it was just collapsing. Leaving Christianity can be a terrifying thing for people. For a lot of us, it felt like ripping out pieces of your soul. Everything from the fear of hell that had been drilled into us for years, thinking that the fear of eternal damnation was sort of right at your back, waiting to get you, threatening to pull you down to the devil. Those kind of fears were there. But eventually you realize that's just part of the narrative of how Christianity is a toxic relationship. It's like an abusive person that keeps on saying, I'm allowed to abuse you. I'm allowed to hurt you, and you need to call it love. and you can't survive without me. And as terrifying as it was to leave, staying felt far worse. I had been abused. I had been drowning for so long in this worldview that I'd forgotten what it was to live and breathe and dance and be alive. And as it were, with trembling hands and a pounding heart, I stepped off the cliff. I chose freedom, not really knowing where it would take me, knowing I couldn't go back to these lies. I had to escape the lies and the abuse. These past 5 years have been about reclaiming myself, piece by piece. And I've gained so much. I've gained freedom of thought. I no longer have to twist my mind to defend indefensible doctrines and ideas. My thoughts are mine again. I'm free to explore and question without fear. I've reclaimed my body. I'm no longer a vessel of sin. I'm alive and vibrant. I feel at home in my own skin, free to live and love and desire without shame. I've gained autonomy. My life is mine. I'm not dictated by ancient rules. I'm the one steering the ship, deciding my own path. And that freedom is more precious than I could have ever imagined. The scars are still there, reminders of many battles that have been fought. But they don't define me. They're proof of my survival and of the strength and bravery it took to walk away, which many of you know all too well. As I've looked back on this, I've thought there's several big points I want to leave you with. Several big ideas that have defined my deconversion and have defined my life since then. Number one, Christianity is mythology. That's probably the biggest thing I could say. Christianity is mythology. It's all mythology. These are lies. It's a line I'd never thought I'd say. Not when I was a believer, at least. I used to think Christianity was the truth, capital T, an eternal, unchanging truth that God had revealed to us lowly humans. The good news of salvation, the God who created us, who loved us, but was somehow planning to damn most of us for eternity. He was the one orchestrating this, and his book was good news, and it was the truth. You have to ask yourself, though, what kind of good news is it when most people go to hell? Jesus is clear that the way to salvation is very narrow, and very few get there. The way to damnation is very wide, and many people go there. But as I was deconverting, I kept going back over and over to this one big idea: Christianity is mythology. It's no different than these ancient stories about Zeus or Thor or any of the other gods that humans have worshipped and made up throughout history. The parallels are uncanny. Dying and rising gods, virgin births, cosmic battles between good and evil. It's all versions of recycled material. I spent years thinking these stories were unique, that Jesus' sacrifice was this one-of-a-kind event in human history. And I heard the Christian apologists trying to defend that tooth and nail. But I kept on digging deeper, and deeper, and deeper. It turns out, dying and resurrecting gods were a dime a dozen in the ancient world. And the more I studied, the more I saw that Christianity had just borrowed these old tales and slapped a new name on it. And they ultimately convinced millions of us that it was the real deal and the only real deal. And it's humbling and humiliating to realize that we've built our entire lives on the foundation of a myth. But it was also freeing, of course, once you get to the point of realizing that Christianity was just that, just another piece of human fiction. And you're no longer bound by its rules and its stories and its guilt. It's like finding out Santa Claus isn't real. Yeah, there's a little grief in losing the magic, but there's also relief. I mean, you stop worrying whether Santa's looking at you saying, "Are you naughty or nice?" I think another big piece of this for me was just realizing that the trauma of original sin, the idea of you're born broken and worthless and a sinner, is just completely false. It's one of the most abusive messages out there that Christian parents are all too glad to give to their kids. And just shovel it down their throats, as it were, shove it in their minds and say, "You are bad, bad, bad. You are born condemned. And God wants to rescue you, but you have to start with the idea that you're bad first. And then we'll talk about God's grace." But from the moment you take your first breath, you're already condemned. You're inherently sinful, broken, unworthy, and your only hope your only way to be fixed is to surrender to this cosmic God who, ironically, created you that way in the first place. I mean, talk about a toxic relationship. Looking back, I see how deeply this idea messes with our sense of self-worth. We never feel good enough. We're always trying to repent harder, believe deeper, be better. And it was never enough. That's the trap that Christianity sets for us. It's like a treadmill that you can't get off. You keep running, but you're never going to reach the finish line. And God is just standing there with a stopwatch saying, not fast enough, not fast enough. And I know the messages Christians would give us, you're not supposed to look at your own efforts. You're not supposed to be on a treadmill. You're supposed to rest in the finished work of Christ. He did it all. He's saying, yes, you're not fast enough, but Christ was. You're not good enough, but Christ is. That's the point. But when you look at how it actually works, practically, it's not the way their theology dictates. It ends up being very much about you and your activities, about you and the way you live. And the grace that you think is so real, you find out it's just a phantom, and it is an incredibly graceless religion. When I deconverted, I realized I wasn't broken. None of us are. The concept of original sin is an abusive mind game designed to keep us dependent, to make us feel like we need salvation, when we were never lost in the first place. It's like, when someone runs an ad where they tell you, oh, this product is so popular that, there's only 100 of them left and it's 75% off today, so get it quick. It's just a sales gimmick. You were fine without it. There's no scarcity. This whole thing is a lie. They're just selling you a product. Christianity is just selling you a product. And we were the suckers in the room that bought it. And that's when the healing really starts for us. When we finally let go of these beliefs that we needed to be saved. You don't need saving. You need to see yourself for who you really are, as a whole, complete human being who never needed the approval of some ancient Canaanite demigod. Along those lines, a third point I would say that's been huge on my mind is just breaking free from the psychological terrorism of Christianity that's wrapped up in messages like hell. I mean, fear is their weapon of choice. One of the most insidious parts of Christianity is this idea of eternal conscious torment. Like, God's going to have this eternal barbecue where billions of souls end up forever and they never get to end it and die. They just kind of keep on screaming in pain forever. And that's your good Father? It's hard to let your mind go there for even a few seconds, to think that's what I really believed, and I was okay with that on some level. But the fear of hell is sort of always lurking beneath the surface, like a dark cloud, hanging over every decision we make, especially in the sense of keeping you in line to make sure that you're not unwittingly headed there. You think your salvation's secure, but it's really not. Hell is a real deal, so you better be careful. And of course, it always drives you to be, as a Christian, active in your evangelism. You have to save the lost. It keeps you from questioning too much. It drives you to pray a lot. Have desperate prayers for yourself to make sure you're begging for forgiveness, just in case you miss something, and to beg for the salvation of the lost souls around you. Hell is just another tool of control. And when you realize that, the weight of Christianity starts to lift. It really does. What kind of loving God needs the threat of eternal torture to get you to love him? It's not love, it's abuse. It's spiritual terrorism, plain and simple. Let go of hell. Let it go. Hell is just a myth. Hell is just a myth. I think another big piece of this puzzle for me was the psychological manipulation of just have faith, just trust. And you realize that faith is the opposite of critical thinking. And you realize that Christianity isn't just discouraging critical thinking, it's actively suppressing it and punishing you for it. You're taught from the very beginning that doubt is the enemy and that questioning is ultimately sinful. Proverbs 3:5, lean not on your own understanding. And this was huge for me and for many of you. I'd been conditioned to trust the Bible, to trust the church, to trust the Christian leaders around me. But don't trust yourself. Don't trust your mind, your logic, your instincts. That's part of your fallen nature. It's part of your pride. It's part of your sin. They're unreliable. They're tainted by sin. So when you first start to have doubts, your first reaction as a Christian is going to be, I can't trust these thoughts. I have to doubt my doubts. And it's a clever system in a sense, very sneaky system. The more you doubt, the more you're told you need more faith. It's like a never-ending cycle that keeps you trapped in this prison, and you're just too afraid to break out. Doubt is healthy. Skepticism is healthy. It's important to ask the hard questions. It's the mind's way of saying, something's wrong here. Something doesn't add up. And once you give yourself permission to really doubt, say, truly, maybe this worldview is completely erroneous. That's when you start to find yourself open to answers that you never thought possible before. And that's when eventually you realize that the answers that Christianity had been offering you, they weren't just unsatisfying. They were designed to intentionally keep you in the dark. It's like your brain wakes up for the very first time. It's exhilarating. You're so glad that you finally have this freedom. And I think that leads me next to this fifth point, reclaiming my identity. How many of us sort of have this as a rallying cry? That you don't have to follow the script. Christianity sort of hands you a script from the moment that you're born, at least if you're born into a Christian family. It tells you who you are, how you should live, how you should think, what your purpose is. And like good actors, so many of us follow the script for decades. We play the part of the humble, God-fearing Christian, the Bible-loving person that's always glad to give a reason for the hope that is in us, always striving to be more Christ-like, always denying parts of ourselves that don't fit the role. But when you leave the faith, you realize that script was never yours to begin with. It was something handed down to you, designed to make you play a part that served the church and the Christian culture. It wasn't you. It wasn't your real identity. And eventually you have to discover for yourself, who am I? Maybe in some ways you're like, I don't know. I don't feel like I've ever lived a day in my life before. It's a strange feeling, but it's so freeing. Leaving Christianity was like ripping up that script. And at first you have no idea who you are without it, but over time you start to write your own story. You start to explore the parts of you that have been suppressed and ignored for so long. Your passions, your desires, your thoughts. All the things you were told to deny because they weren't godly. It's an amazing thing to reclaim who you are. It's a process, but you have to start and start to build slowly, line by line, until you realize, I have found out who I am. This is who I am. And I don't need anyone's permission to be me. I have full freedom and rights to be myself. And I don't have to believe like you. I don't have to think like you. I don't have to subscribe to your worldview. And you can threaten me all you want with hell. I'm going to ignore it. It's like you're stepping into the light after living in the shadows for so long. I think a big one for me, number 6, is healing the shame that you have around your body and even your sexuality. Christianity teaches you to not be comfortable in your own skin, to sort of hate your own body. It's very toxic. It instills this shame in you from a young age. Your body is sinful. Your desires are dangerous. You need to constantly monitor and suppress them. Purity culture does such a number on all of us. And for years, I absolutely carried that shame. I saw my body as a vessel of sin in this great dichotomy of body versus spirit. The body was something to be controlled, hidden, ignored, and judged. And when I deconverted, I began to understand how incredibly warped that perspective is. My body is not something to be ashamed of. It's mine to enjoy, to explore, to love, to delight in. It takes time to untangle those layers of shame that Christianity wraps us in, but when you pull back those layers, you become free. I think the last thing I would say is that it's been a big piece of my journey to say you can create your own purpose outside of Christianity. The freedom, again, can feel terrifying at times, but it's also exhilarating. But when you leave Christianity and you figure out what comes next, you realize that for so long your purpose had been dictated by the church, by God, by the Bible. And when you walk away, it's like stepping into a void. Who am I now? What is my life about? What's my purpose? What defines success? But over time, you figure out that you can create your own meaning. You don't need a book, or a pastor, or a God, or a theology to tell you what your life is all about. You can decide for yourself. And that's what I've done. I've built a life of meaning that's centered on authenticity, truth, love, connection, kindness, and things like that that just make such a difference to me. Not because a God commanded me to, but because I choose to. And I found purpose in simply being human, flawed, beautiful, free. 5 years. Feels like a lifetime, but it feels like the blink of an eye. I've deconstructed so much that I once believed in, and I've built something far more beautiful. Freedom. Freedom to think, to feel, to question, to be. And you know what? If you're on this journey, whether you're just starting or you've been walking this path for a while, you're not alone. The road is hard, but we're with you, and it's worth every step of the way. So raise your glass, as it were. Cheers to 5 years of leaving for me. Cheers to however long it's been for you since you left, since you escaped the Bible prison. Let's make the next few years better and better and better. Let's make our community better. Let's make our affection and kindness toward each other increase so much that we just feel like, wow, truly, they will know we are atheists by our love. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I hope you're finding the same freedom, the same joy, the same light, the same peace, the same love that I'm finding. We've got this. We'll get through it together. Thanks so much for being a part of my first 5 years out. Some of you have been around just for a few months, some of you for a few years. Some of you were there and you remember the very first video I did 4 or so years ago. I can't say thank you enough to those of you who have stuck with me through these 4+ years of YouTube, through the journey, through lots of technical issues that are still out there, working to make it better every day. But the channel's going to improve, and more importantly, our thoughts and ideas are going to improve. Our community is going to improve. We're going to just love each other. As I like to say, we're going to bless each other's socks off. It's a crazy journey. Life's crazy. What can you say? But I'm so glad I escaped Christianity. I couldn't go back if I tried. It's not real. That's where this started from. I'll repeat the words that I said to myself 5 years ago. It's not real. You can make it real in your head if you want to. For a while, you can pretend. You can try so much to say, I have to have this. I have to have this system, this structure. Try as you may. The closer you look at the origins of Christianity and the origins even of just like the things that Jesus did and the sayings, you realize they're copying them from older mythologies. It's not real. Yahweh was never listening to my prayers. Jesus was never listening to my prayers. It's not real. You can be free. I am so glad that I escaped Christianity 5 years ago. I can't wait to see what the next 5 years hold. Thanks for being with me on this journey. Have a great day.